Hi, in this video I want to talk about my favorite French military strategist, General André Beaufre. In particular, a book that he wrote, published I think in 1966 under the title of Stratégie de l'Action, which I'm translating as Action Strategy. No, the book, as far as I know, has not been translated into English, and not only that, but it's no longer in print in French, which is really too bad. The book is really very good. Now, perhaps you might also be asking, Shirkin, didn't you already do a video or two or three about Beaufre? Why are you doing this again? And the answer quite simply is that I'm in the process of revising a chapter that I've written about Beaufre in a book that I've written about French military strategy. I'm revising it for our publisher. And while revising the chapter, I realized that I needed to revisit this book. So that's what I did. And then why I'm doing this video is really kind of my effort to try to get my head around it and digest Beaufre to help me think through it in order so that I could do a better job. So bear with me. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Please, if you like this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe if you have not already. Also, if you feel so inspired in order to support my channel directly, please feel free to go to the thanks button on YouTube or even join the memberships. Likewise, there's a link to a Buy Me a Coffee in the description below, and there you can also toss me some money or sign up for a membership, etc. Thank you very much. It really helps. Before I get to the book, I want to say a few words about Beaufre and his career. Beaufre lived from 1902 to 1975. He attended France's military academy at Saint-Cyr and in the 1920s, and then he was wounded in action in the Rif War in Morocco. That war, for those of you who are not super familiar with it, maybe that's worth doing a separate video on because it's kind of like a big deal. Actually, it was a very big war. It was fought by France and Spain against some Berber tribes in Morocco from 1921 to 1926. Although I think the French involvement was only from like 24 to 26, something like that. Anyways, fast forward to 1940. Beaufre was part of the French Army's general staff during the war with Germany, which did not go well. He ended up in and escaped from prison, and then he fled to North Africa afterward, and there he joined the effort to reorganize the French army and to get it back into the fight. He then saw action with the French army as an officer. I'm not sure what his rank was. Maybe he was a colonel in North Africa and then in Italy. And then afterward, he participated in the landing in southern France called Operation Dragoon, which was in August of 1944. So then he fought his way into Alsace, fought in Alsace, and then fought his way into Germany. He later served in Indochina, and then he was a division commander in Algeria during the Algerian War. He was also the commander of French forces during the 1956 Suez War. It's fair to say, if you add this all up, it's fair to say that Beaufre's career was hardly crowned with success. I mean, he rose to the ranks, yes. So on that level, he was successful. But the wars he was involved with were a string of failures. It was catastrophes even. So one lost war after another. I actually think that this is important because my whole argument for the value of reading French military strategy is not that they were victorious, but because they lost, they had to put enormous thought into understanding what the heck went wrong. Why did they lose? So basically, with Beaufre, here's an exceptionally intelligent man who dedicated his very considerable intellectual powers to this query, like what the hell happened, what went wrong, and what does this mean, and what are the possible lessons that we can take? And frankly, I find that much more useful than the kind of victory lap that maybe Allied or American generals would have written, let's say after the war, talking about, everything was great. Beaufre is like, no, everything sucked. Let me tell you why it sucked, and let me try to understand why it sucked. I think that his thoughtfulness and his clarity of thinking, and frankly, he was brilliant, but his clarity of writing is what makes him the best of France's 20th century military strategists by far, and among the very best Western military thinkers, period. Now, the real gem of Beaufre's production, so he left the army, I think, in 1961. He spent the rest of his life writing, until he couldn't anymore. The real gem in his library is this book here, Introduction à la stratégie, Introduction to Strategy. It has been translated into English. However, it's very difficult to get one's hands on it. There are PDFs floating around the internet, but you have to pay for them. You have to subscribe to some sort of service, and I haven't done it yet. I really should. If I ever do, I'm going to be very content to copy it and then circulate it. But anyways, it's a great book. If you can read French, if you read one book of military strategy, you should read this book. Now, Beaufre then went on. He wrote many other books. The next book, and he referred to this as a triptych. So this is the first in the triptych, and then there's this book, Dissuasion en stratégie, which is deterrence and strategy, which I do think was translated into English. And then the third book is the one we're talking about now, which is Action Strategy, which I don't have a hard copy of. I only have an ebook that I was able to find on the internet. So that's what I've been reading. So let's get into it. Now, rather than to walk you through the book, I want to try to distill from it several main points, and each will have a separate section in the video. There's going to be some overlap because of the way Beaufre's thinking develops through the book, so bear with me, but I think it's necessary. Now, the first part about Beaufre's argument, which will get a separate section, is his belief that conflict after World War II had fundamentally changed in some important ways, which means that strategy had to be thought in a very different way. The second part of Beaufre's thinking is his thinking about total strategy and the place of military strategy within the larger construct of his total strategy. And finally, the third amounts to an attempt by Beaufre to sketch out a method, a concrete method for making strategy. Okay, so part one, everything is different. Beaufre believed that the nature of conflict had changed, owing in large part to nuclear weapons, but also to three other developments. One is the imperative of having a total strategy, which I'll get into much more detail later, but okay, we got to say it now. Another is the preeminence of psychological factor. The psychological factor, basically everything is psychological warfare. Everything, all action needs to be thought of in terms of psychological warfare and the psychological effect that it has on one's adversary. And the third is what I would call the multipolarity or the multilaterality, is that a word, of all conflicts, such that no conflicts between two nations are really actually just between the two nations, because there are actually other parties, third parties, that are out there, and they count far more than they ever have before, and thus must be written into strategy, must be thought about as part of strategy making. Okay, so let's unpack all of this. First, just to put it out there, the importance of nuclear weapons for Beaufre is that it means that the nuclear powers can no longer attack each other directly. Conflict between nuclear powers has to be indirect, and indirect strategy is something that he writes a lot about. Beaufre studied very carefully the writings of the British strategist Basil, Liddell, Hart. I really need to do a separate video about Hart. Apparently the two also corresponded. And so Hart is his name is associated with the concept of indirect strategy. So because of nuclear weapons, indirect strategy now becomes the necessary and the primary means by which the great powers go at one another. This is how they impose their will on each other. This is how they advance their interests relative at each other's expense. Beaufre also found that even aside from nuclear weapons, for all sorts of other reasons, it had become politically and militarily necessary for warring parties to adopt indirect strategies rather than direct strategies, or to complement the direct strategies. So you need to have a combination of them. So the obvious example is what today we might call asymmetrical warfare, although when Beaufre was writing about this, he really had in mind the national liberation wars against colonial powers, such as the ones that he was involved with in Indochina and Algeria. When a weaker party is unable to achieve decision on the battlefield through direct confrontation, what weaker parties now do is they seek decision somewhere else, although perhaps even through non-military means. This is what Beaufre in the Introduction to Strategy described as an external maneuver. The purpose of this all is to limit the adversary's liberty of action and, above all, to sap its will. He's going to say more about all these things. Now, this, of course, brings us to the need for total strategy, which, again, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail below. But what's essential for Beaufre is the conviction that now more than ever, military action has to be subordinate to policy. Wars must serve a political purpose. Winning a war means absolutely nothing. What matters is whether it achieves the desired political end. It's the political reality after the war that matters, and that's what one needs to be striving for. Given this belief, it follows that for both, strategists and planners need to consider all the means available to achieve the political ends, with military action being simply merely one of the possible forms of maneuver. Maneuver being defined, I don't remember if Beaufre had a specific definition of maneuver, but I like Castex's, Admiral Raoul Castex's definition of maneuver. I'm paraphrasing. Basically, maneuver is anything you can do to create a better situation for yourself. Although he could take it a little bit further, and sometimes Castex and other French theorists would talk about how it's anything you could do to regain the initiative. Or another way of putting it is anything you can do to increase your liberty of action and to decrease the liberty of action of your adversary. Anyways, military action according to Beaufre, is just one of many possible forms of maneuver. And it also follows that without a sound and rigorous political analysis before entering into conflict, one absolutely is going to fail. You have to think first, and you have to be able to articulate clearly the desired political end. Everything has to be built around that. The worst possible thing he believed was to skip this whole step altogether and to call upon armed force, just send in the troops because they're just going to resolve it or fix it, or you're just going to defer the issue of trying to define your political end goal, etc. This is really important. Remember, he was the commander at Suez, where Suez, the French military and the British military and the Israeli military went out on a limb and they pursued a military strategy. But they didn't pursue other kinds of strategy, and they got ahead of themselves because suddenly third powers got involved and put an end to all that. Or the Indochina War, where France really never did a good job of articulating, well, what does it actually really want? Even Algeria, what is the goal of fighting Algeria? Is to keep Algeria French, but what exactly does that apply? So they went ahead and they fought a war without really being able to identify what is the objective. And for Beaufre, given his experience, this is a disastrous thing to do. The key element of action, Beaufre writes, is first of all will, the will of the person who undertakes the action. Next, there's the will of the person who opposes that action. So you've got two wills opposed to one another. Meaning that, according to Beaufre, because it's all about will, he says that it's all about psychological elements. It's all about psychology. In contrast, Beaufre writes, this is interesting, he says that material means, the means of war, only serve as instruments of will. So for that reason, he thought that thanks to the development of media, stuff like the radio and television, and today he would certainly say social media, he said that the psychological domain becomes the essential and decisive zone of action. It's not military action, it's the psychological domain. So it's not fighting necessarily, destroying the enemy, it's acting upon within the psychological domain. And he says that this is a challenge for Westerners because he says, quote, we are more apt to calculate in tons of primary materials and dollars, in the numbers of troops and tanks and megatons, rather than ideas. But the ideas are more important. And he says that this puts the West at a disadvantage versus, let's say, communists, and maybe today you would say against maybe jihadists, because it has nothing very strong ideologically speaking with which to counter the revisionist ideas and ideologies put forth by the West's enemies. Beaufre wrote that we still lack a, quote, force de frappe, a psychological force de frappe referring to the French nuclear deterrence capability. Part of what Beaufre is wrestling with here are arguments put forth by Marxists who have embraced a deterministic understanding of history, according to which certain outcomes are inevitable. For Beaufre, this is nonsense. There are always inflection points where, if one has the will, one can maneuver and thus shape the course of events. Although after a while, at some point, it becomes too late. So the trick is to act early, to act proactively, and in this sense, a wait-and-see approach is a very, very bad idea. Okay, so next we have this idea of the multipolarity or the multilaterality, if that's a word, of conflicts. So the way Beaufre understands this is that in modern conflict, okay, you've got your country, and then you've got your enemy. Your country is what he calls, that's country A. And then you've got allies, and the allies are B. And then there's the adversary, the principal adversary, which is C. And then you have the rest of the world, which he categorizes as D. Actually, I think he wrote E, which doesn't make any sense. But anyways, let's call it D. They, D, are not directly related in the conflict, but in the modern world, they can, to varying degrees, have a profound influence on the outcome of the war, either favorably or unfavorably. So A, you, right, have to act upon C, the enemy, and you need to do it with the support of B. All the while, you're trying to enlist D and keep D from supporting C. So you've got you and your allies, and you're acting against your enemy, but at the same time, you have to court everybody else, all of the neutrals, D, because they can sway events. And because your enemy is also trying to sway them, you can get them involved. You can get them involved in certain ways that are going to help hurt your enemy or help yourself. So you're competing for the sympathies of the neutrals. And this is really very important. Now, often the way this works is that A versus C. So you and your enemy, you can work upon each other through direct action. But this whole business of courting D and shoring up your allies, this can often be more of a question of indirect action. So he says that A and C can go each other with a direct strategy, but he says even if this works, this can only result in a stable result if it has a support of D, or if D elects to remain passive. So think again of Suez, where D, in this case the United States, decides not to remain passive and then steps in and messes with the whole thing. Or A and C can opt for purely indirect strategies. So the focus of their whole strategy is to appeal to D in order to gain D's support. This form of action is slower, but it can overturn the balance of power of A and C. So particularly if A and C are equally matched, or if one or the other is just too weak to deal with the enemy on its own directly, you focus on D, you focus on the third parties, and get them involved because that can tilt the balance in your favor. If A is clearly militarily superior to C, it can try to achieve a decision through military means, while only dealing with D to ensure its neutrality. You beat up your enemy while trying to keep everybody else just out of it. So this can work, according to Beaufre, but only if you're strong enough, and speed helps. You got to do this really fast. If A, however, is inferior to C, but believes it's got the moral will, the moral reserves, as he puts it, then its direct action against C needs to simply be focused on gaining time, holding on. You got to make the conflict last. And while you use indirect action, essentially, to push on D in order to get D to intervene in ways that benefit it. So this is classic asymmetrical warfare. This is, like what the Viet Cong did or the Viet Minh did. You can't take on the Americans or you can't take on the French. But what you do is you act upon the world or indirect power or other parties in order to get them to get involved one way or the other. It's classic, and this can actually work. It's slow, but it can work. If A and C are roughly equal, its indirect confrontation must aim to break to its advantage the balance of power by attracting into Group B a maximum of the elements of D, and then to defeat C through a direct confrontation. He says this is what happened in the two world wars. Okay, so now we're on part 2, total strategy. Beaufre was convinced that military action in the modern world really had little chance to be decisive. He described this in terms of losing its autonomy. Military strategy lost its autonomy, if it ever really had any. Military strategy, therefore, had to be no more than one part of a holistic total strategy that involved various other non-military strategies. And he spoke of economic strategies, diplomatic strategies, political strategies. There's a whole range of non-military maneuvers that you can do that have a powerful effect either on your adversary or, remember, D, because you're trying to court D. You need to think about all of this also in terms of morale. You're trying to sap the enemy's morale. You want to divide the adversary. You want to grow your B. You want to influence D one way or the other. And part of the art of war now is understanding where military action fits into this whole construct, if it even fits in at all, because very often it's actually not appropriate. Beaufre talked about domains. Today we speak about maritime domain, air domain, cyber and space domains, etc. For Beaufre, domains are more about war versus politics versus economics. Above all, there's a psychological domain. It's also good to remember that Beaufre, at least in the introduction to strategy, argued for renouncing any division between wartime and peacetime. He says that's over. Now, in the modern world, we live perpetually in a state of war peace and with our rivals and with our adversaries, meaning that we always need to be following a total strategy. The only real difference between war and peace is simply whether or not there's a military component to our total strategy. Or rather, there's always a military component because it might just be in terms of preparation, building, fortification, developing military capacity, but just not necessarily using it. And war is really just using it while doing all the other things at once. And he said that Beaufre insisted that this is really always the case. So the example he draws he points to is actually Waterloo. He said, look, even in Waterloo, which on the face of it looks like a classic example of decision through a military battle. It's a decisive battle that ended the war. But he argues that, okay, fine, but Waterloo never would have happened if it had not been for this extraordinary diplomatic effort on the part of the members of the coalition come together, to hold together, and for everybody to stand together on the battlefield at Waterloo. So yes, there's military action, but that military action was not in isolation with all these other forms of maneuver. Part 3, method. And arguably, this is the most intriguing part of Beaufre's book because he's attempting to articulate concrete guidance for military strategists and other planners. The crucial step for Beaufre is to do a rigorous analysis, not just of one's adversaries, but of oneself and all of the relevant third parties. So it's not just A, but B and C and D. Analysis of what, you might ask? Okay, well, the analysis needs to account for all the drivers and interests of all the parties involved, including what he calls the sensitive points of all the players, the points of weakness. What motivates them? What might demotivate them? What is it that would affect their will to sustain the conflict, or to fight, or to not to fight, or to get involved in the fight in one way or the other? And as for analyzing oneself, then this needs to include an appreciation of one's own vulnerabilities, ideally to anticipate what the adversary might attempt to do to weaken your own will. So you identify this is our vulnerabilities, these are our soft spots, and then how do we cover them? Remember, this can't just be military soft spots and military vulnerabilities. This is about total strategy. So do we have an economic soft spot? Do we have a popular will soft spot, or democracy, or wavering will, or public opinion, or what is it? Where are vulnerabilities that the enemy will play upon in order to weaken our will? The alternative is to be caught by surprise, which he says should never really happen if you do your analysis correctly. And both talked about contre-aléatoire maneuvers. Contre-aléatoire, I think, translates as like things that you do in order to move against the unpredicted and to minimize the unpredictability of what your enemy is going to be. There's a lot you can try to predict. There's a lot you can't predict, and you really need to try your hardest in order to predict all of it. Of course, you can't, but you need to try and to do as much as you can. Beaufre wrote, by the way, that if France had done this kind of analysis correctly after World War II, it would have realized that its colonial wars, Indochina and Algeria, were futile and would not have gotten involved in them. Beaufre described this kind of analysis as resulting in a clavier, or a keyboard, right? You think about a keyboard on a typewriter, really more like on a piano. And what you do is, the fruit of the analysis is to define the range of keys and the variety of keys that you have at your disposal, and the keys that you can activate, that you can action in order to have some sort of effect. And planning, therefore, requires identifying the keys and figuring out which to press and when, because often there's an appropriate sequence. Also, you have to think about, well, what is the enemy's clavier? What do they got in front of them? What keys do they have in front of them that they can action? And the same is true for D. Like, what are they doing? Part of this is also about identifying where and how a direct strategy might be appropriate, and where and how an indirect strategy might be appropriate. Usually you need some sort of combination of the two in the modern world, although according to Beaufre, as I said, he thought that indirect strategies had really become more the norm than not. Beaufre's favorite example of how this is done is Hitler's campaign against Czechoslovakia, which for Beaufre is like chef's kiss, right? According to Beaufre, what Hitler did was to only act militarily after having already prepared the ground through an effective diplomatic and psychological maneuver. So he acted after identifying correctly what maneuver would actually be decisive, and understanding the proper place of military action in the context of this whole strategy. So with regard to the Czechs, according to Beaufre, the Germans did 4 phases. They had 4 phases of action. First, there is the phase 1, the phase of the preparation of military means and national opinion. So you need to give yourself the means for military action, but you also need to work on your own opinion, popular opinion, so that, people are kind of on board with this. And then phase 2 is what he said, the phase of psychological and diplomatic preparation with the purpose of isolating the adversary. And this is described in terms of an indirect action. Here the adversary is Czechoslovakia. So through psychological action, diplomatic action, you want to isolate Czechoslovakia as much as possible to scare it. And you're doing this through indirect means. Then comes the first phase of execution, which was an indirect confrontation, which led to an accord with the British and the French. Then the fourth, final, second and final phase of execution is obliging the Czechs to actually capitulate under threat, because now you've got the actual military going in. What's critical, according to Beaufre, is to understand that the decisive action here was not the military part. It was actually the indirect confrontation with Britain and France. That's what made Czechoslovakia affordable. That's what made Czechoslovakia fall into Hitler's hand. It was that. It's that diplomatic and psychological warfare that he did on the British and the French. That's how he won Czechoslovakia. The military stuff, the direct confrontation with Czechoslovakia, only came at the end of that maneuver when the conditions for success had already been realized. It was already a done deal. There are some interesting passages in Beaufre's book that actually made me think of Gaza, frankly. And these are passages that deal with how often the parties to a conflict suffer from internal policy contradictions that reflect conflicting internal priorities. So with Gaza, like Israel since 7 October has faced this almost impossible choice. Reminds me of Sophie's choice, but this impossible choice between focusing on securing the release of the hostages versus focusing on pursuing the war against Hamas. Regrettably, these two things are contradictory, and you have to decide. And I think the Israeli government has really struggled with its decision, is kind of hemmed and hawed because of popular opinion and this and that. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to do. Anyway, Beaufre says that there are contradictions. If there are these sorts of contradictions, there are going to be basically three responses. One response is to renounce the terms of the contradiction with all the sacrifices that implies. So in Israel's case, it would be like you write off the hostage and say, screw it, they're dead anyway, so let's just focus on fighting Hamas. Or you do the opposite, like forget about fighting Hamas, we got to focus on saving the hostages. And, you just sort of accept the cost of that, right? Something's got to give, and so that's what you do. Ideally, you find a solution that synthesizes the contradictions and thereby nullifies the contradiction, which is extremely difficult. And then third, which is all too common, is that you don't decide or you delay the decision, and as a result, you're paralyzed. And that often happens. It's probably the worst thing you could possibly do. These contradictions are a count among the sensitive points that countries have. And by attacking or playing with an internal contradiction of your adversary, you see them react, you can poke on this, and you can play with it, and you can paralyze them as a result, and you could weaken them, and it's very, very powerful. Beaufre writes that this sort of analysis should inform the concept of maneuver at the level of political decisions. The focus should be on exploiting the similarities and the contradictions between the political drivers of the different countries that are involved in a conflict. And the best decision at this level is that which expands as much as possible the liberty of decision, the liberty of action on one side, and reduces as much as possible that of your adversary. So basically, you want to reduce the contradictions on your side while multiplying those on the other. So you figure out what are the contradictions that are tearing us apart. So in Israel's case, it might be, this sort of hostages versus Hamas. Recognize that. Know that your enemy is going to play on that, and then deal with it. Figure out what to do. How do you reduce this contradiction one way or the other? Likewise, try to figure out what are the contradictions in your adversary. Can you play with them? Can you manipulate them? Can you poke that sensitive part? That would be very, very useful. This is all indirect strategy, by the way, but this is all very, very powerful and contributes a great deal towards winning a war. Beaufre also wrote that one must recognize that wars that are launched or accepted for lack of any other solution results from a catastrophic political situation, one in which there is no alternative to war. This proves that everything leading up to that moment was a catastrophe, was senseless, was inept, and that the adversary succeeded in denying its antagonist the liberty of decision. It is a situation one must avoid at all costs through dispositions taken on time. It's not hard to imagine how that might relate to the Gaza war. Now, the conception of a military action always, Beaufre repeats over and over again, must begin with the political goal of the imagined action. It is this goal that defines all the actions and defines if you're going to be defensive or offensive, and also are you going to go for major objectives like the complete capitulation of your enemy, or limited objectives, or maybe you're just trying to stop them from doing something. But either way, the definition of this goal is essential. And then once you've done that, you have to figure out the military means that have to be used, if at all, and if one's going for a fast action or a long action. Either way, the strategy has to be total. So you have to figure out, does one have to prepare one's population? What levels of military action are politically acceptable? Can air power or blockades be used? Would they be effective? Are they relevant? Are there weapons like napalm, that's what he says, that's the thing that he cites, that might be politically bad? Are there geographic zones that you risk that you don't want to go to because you risk troubling some of the D countries? You don't want to antagonize them by operating in a certain area. It's also possible that the framework, that when you're looking at your clavier, you can decide that this is insufficient. This isn't going to do the job. And then you got to make a choice. Either go bigger or never mind the political price. Or, and figure out maybe the goal is just too ambitious. Or perhaps there's simply non-military means of achieving the political goal that you want, perhaps through an indirect strategy. Or maybe you just don't do it at all. And then always, according to Beaufre, you must think about how the adversary is going to react. Maybe the adversary will opt for an indirect strategy. Maybe it'll opt for an external maneuver, right? So if you're Israel sizing up Hamas, you know for sure that the Hamas is they're going to play on your contradictions, and they're going to opt for an indirect strategy and an external maneuver. They're going to appeal to the international community because they can't take on the IDF directly, and their military actions against the IDF are really going to be focused simply on hanging on as long as possible. Once action has begun, Beaufre warns, it has to be fast and brutal in order to obtain military objectives as fast as possible, to create an international fait accompli. And that's also something that Beaufre got from watching Czechoslovakia, but also the militarization of the Rhine and all the things that the Nazis did in the 1930s. It's like you act fast, and you do it such that you don't really give the people who could intervene, in that case in the 30s, the British and the French, from intervening. Like, don't give them time to respond. You make it a done deal, and then they're forced to sort of go, okay, all right, fine. And then they don't do anything about it. So anyway, you got to act fast. You've got to be fast and brutal. You obtain your military objectives as quickly as possible. You create an international fait accompli. If one drags this action out, one enables the adversary to mobilize the support that it does enjoy, particularly among D, and to prolong its resistance and to adopt a more indirect strategy. The conflict, first conceived of to be decisive, will devolve into a war of attrition and be resolved by lassitude, meaning it will end because one side is going to get tired out. This, he says, is the failure of any kind of direct maneuver. So any kind of direct maneuver or direct strategy that fails to achieve its objectives quickly will end up like this, and more often than not, you're going to lose. The key, of course, always, Beaufre writes, is to take the initiative. You've got to act. You want to be the one who's acting upon your adversary, not being acted upon. So that's really it. That's Beaufre's book, Strategy of Action, or Action Strategy. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please hit like and subscribe. And if you look in the description, you're going to see, besides the timestamp, I also put links to my Blue Sky, Twitter, LinkedIn, and my Substack, which is also called Pax Americana. I write for that weekly, and my own website, michaelsherkin.com. Stay tuned. There's more in the pipeline, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye-bye.